Okay, so we'll aim to start on time. Is this actually working? No. That one is. Yes. Ooh, yeah. Excellent. Okay, so Andy would like everyone to be reminded that you are supposed to go and give permissions for your email addresses to be used. So that email you got asking you to do that, that would be great. In the spirit of the open community, you have to do that, apparently. So great. So I'm Alan Ashton. I'm the head of Science IT at PSI, and it's my pleasure to actually go through this afternoon up to the coffee break. So right on time, we will start, and we have Wout. You're going to.
I will talk about ontologies. So first, perhaps a warning, just so I'm not legally liable for anything that's about to happen. When you see the word ontology in the title of a presentation, things get esoterical. So sit back and relax. It's going to be fun. You're going to be fine, don't worry. So ontological definition of experimental techniques for fair data. So my name is Wout Nolf. I'm working at the Data Automation Unit. That's a unit led by Andy Getz at the ESRF, doing mostly workflow stuff, but metadata, if you're doing data automation, metadata is something that you need. So that's how I'm involved. So we're all trying to make our data and our results fair. You've seen a lot of, in the present presentation, a lot of initiatives, a lot of time and money is going into this. At the ESRF, this means the data portal for the first two letters are fair. And let's see whether I have, the first two letters are fair, and the Nexus data format for the other two. And the elephant in the room here is that despite the fact that you have all this infrastructure, the reality is that as of today, I can't put exactly a number on it, but more than 90% of the data we publish, we put that in our data portals, in our databases. 90% of our data or more just does not have any metadata. So that is the thesis or the reality, the elephant in the room. So just for those of you who may not have heard about the Nexus data format, so it's an initiative that started in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. So it's more than 20 years. You can go to this website to investigate and see what it's about. It's essentially a common data format for neutron, X-ray, immune science. And so you have a way of defining everything that has to do with your data, which could be instrumentation, your slits, your detectors, and so on, or it could be results of data processing. So here are just two examples of in the field of X-ray reflectometry. I also happen to be the ESRF representative in the NIAC, the Nexus Advisory Committee. So there's a committee which has one representative for every synchrotron and neutron facility. And we're trying to make sure that the Nexus standard stays consistent, but the actual contributions need to come from the community. We are not the ones that describe tomography or XES or any other techniques. We just kind of organize the thing and keep it alive. So I don't know where you are in climbing Mount Fair. This is how I started thinking about this problem recently. For our case in TSRF, we can look at the data portal as being base camp and Nexus being camp 1. We're trying to climb Mount Fair, but the reality is we're here. At least I'm here. I don't know where you are on the mountain, but I am here. I'm just learning to tie my shoes, despite the fact being involved with this so closely. So why am I here? There's different reasons you could come up with. I also used to be a scientist. I wanted metadata, but also I didn't define metadata. And if I try to express why, if you're a specialist and some fair data person comes to you as a scientist and say, okay, you need to provide metadata. Now you're the expert. You understand the enormous complexity of what's going on during an experiment. You understand the complexity of your instrumentation. You understand the complexity of the samples that arrive at your beamline. You understand the complexity of the data processing. You understand essentially what happens in space and time at your beamline. And it's such a wall of something you can't overcome. And if you want to define everything, at the end, you end up defining nothing at all. And that's essentially what mostly happens, in my opinion. So one thing we want to explore, at least at the ESRF and perhaps at other facilities, or inspire other facilities to think about it in the same way, is the first thing is to actually define the scope in which you want to define the metadata. In other words, what you want to do, or what we want to do, is make sure that we define techniques and that all our data that we publish is tagged with technique names. Now you say, okay, well, I mean, we know techniques, right? You have an Excel table, you write down all the techniques. Option number 1, a flat list of technique names per beamline and per facility. I'm pretty sure every facility has a list like that, or more than one. This is just the example of the ESRF, a couple of beamlines, a couple of techniques, and of course this document changes over the years. Some journals have lists like that as well. And the problem of this is that this doesn't contain any meaning. It's just a list of words. And for example, if at beamline ID22 at the ESRF in 2024, the scientists claim to do high-resolution X-ray powder diffraction, if somebody a year later does the same at another synchrotron, there's no way to check whether this is actually the same technique. And probably, most likely, if the scientists of those two beamlines would talk to each other, they would realize it's not exactly the same thing, despite the fact that the technique name is the same. In any case, the problem is that you can't compare techniques or relate them to each other. It's essentially just a list of names. Okay, so can we do something better than option 1? Let's go to option 2. Let's do what the biologists do. Taxonomies, classification. So as you probably know, the Linnaean classification system for plants and animals. Start here with the American black bear, which could be X-ray powder diffraction. And you know that this is, well, it's a bear, which is then part of, the bear, what is it the bear likes with pandas and so on. And then it's the carnivore mammals and so on. Anyway, so that's what biologists do, as you know. And these classes, they mean something. Now, I'm not a biologist, so I don't know what an order is in a family, but biologists seem to understand what this means. At least I hope they do. Does something like that exist in our field, in techniques? Yes. It's at least that I'm only aware of one of them, and it's called the Planet Ontology, and it provides a taxonomy, so a classification, and thesaurus, so synonyms, of photon and neutron experimental techniques. So this was something developed in the context of EXPANS. So I'm here putting a screenshot of it. So you have essentially a tree-like structure, and you can say that X-ray reflectivity and neutron reflectometry, they're somehow part of reflectometry. So there is some sort of relationship. But when I discuss this with different scientists and also look at it myself, it's really hard to understand what these relationships actually mean. You can sort of intuitively understand them, but if you really think about it, what meaning can a computer extract from this? So you have a class structure, but the class structure doesn't have meaning. Biologists have meaning because these classes, these levels, they mean something. In this case, this is missing. So then option number 3 is to go for an ontology, and this is where things get esoterical. So sit back, relax, don't worry. So the idea is that what you want to do is to build or compose a definition of a technique with basic building blocks. So think of it as Lego. So you want to build castles and boats and cars, which are our techniques. And we have some building blocks, which in ontology they're called, it's called description logic. And then from them you can compose and build techniques. And the relationship between techniques will be automatically inferred by a reasoning system based on description logic. And this reasoning can also guide the creation of new building blocks. One thing to note here is that techniques can be defined only to the extent in which they need to be distinguished from each other. That's a very important point. I'll come back to that later. Ultimately, what you can do is you can connect ontologies together to one centralized one, and also connect ontologies to other scientific domains, material science, physics, biology. And meaning the meaning of your technique will also be enriched by those connections. Okay, so how does this go in practice? A knowledge engineer and a scientist sit together one day, and the knowledge engineer enters the office and he has a box of Lego blocks. And he says to the scientist, well, here is a box of Lego blocks. Please start building your own techniques. The scientist is looking at the box and is asking the knowledge engineer, yeah, but what have people been building with this? And the knowledge engineer says, well, I mean, all kinds of ships and castles and all that. And then the scientist says, okay, I understand. But here at my beamline, we're interested in trucks, you know. So we're gonna need some wheels, and you don't have wheels in this box. Also, the first scientist that needs to define a ship doesn't need to worry about the fact that there are more than different types of ships, frigates, battleships, cogs. A ship is a thing that floats on water. And the next scientist comes in, well, I have a rubber ball, it flows on water as well, but it's not a ship, is it? So that's how you start creating this box of Lego blocks. So let's get away from Lego. If it was Lego, I'm pretty sure you would all be doing this immediately. It's a bit more complex than that. So we don't have Lego blocks. We have essentially words. Those are Lego blocks. And I'm just giving one particular example here of a technique that they do at the Beamline IA24 of the SRF. It's a technique called laser-driven shock compression X-ray absorption spectroscopy. I'm giving this because when you think about techniques, you think powder diffraction or single crystal, but the technique is typically, if you go, it's a bit more than just absorption or tomography or diffraction. And the building blocks are everything that's happening during the experiment, at least to an extent in which you want to distinguish it from other techniques. So in this experiment, what comes in, typically you think, wow, it's X-rays, but it's more than X-rays. It could be something that changes the temperature, a cryostream, or something pressure, diamond envelope cells. In this case, it's a laser. Then stuff happens to the sample and something comes out that you detect as a function of space and time. And so this technique would be composed of a couple of words in a language which is a logical language. And in ontology, they have tools for that, so it's actually a software. This is just an example. It's a tool called Protege, and this is a technique called X-ray refractometry. And what you're seeing here is essentially three different things. So you have an international resource identifier. So think about the F in FAIR. You need to define a technique that the whole world knows about. Then you have labels for human beings, acronyms or full labels, and then this is the description logic. Of course, I don't have time to go into that, but this is a way of you would use word and mathematics or logic to describe the technique. And then the relationship between techniques is actually derived from this. So when you add new techniques, you almost talk like a human being creating a technique, and then the relationship between techniques is actually generated by a reasoner. And finally, so this is an idea that we're having. We want to play with this description logic and see whether there's a way we can define at least all the panel techniques, and try to see whether there's a way of defining a common strategy or roadmap on how to build and maintain ontologies, perhaps for every institute, and how to connect to a central one. Because the way your building blocks, you may not like my building blocks, but you can use your building blocks and I use mine, and they're connected ontologically. And so essentially, ultimately, after a couple of years, you would create a common vocabulary and meaning, which arises from the different connections between ontologies. And also, at some point, you can connect this to other ontologies, for example, related to the Nexus standard, something that people are also working on. Finally, just in very practical sense, the short-term goal for the ESRF is, again, we want to tag all the data we produce, both in AJ5 and in a data portal in ICAD with technique names. And the idea is that we want to add techniques very fast without the need for endless discussions and committees and so on. And then the endless discussions and committees can come later over time. and every institute could do this independently. Now, of course, you can think of much longer goals. For example, you could say that the nexus definition, because if you have a lot of data and a lot of techniques and they're connected to each other, data has motor positions and units, has kind of information, and you have the techniques, then you know what kind of metadata you would need to define. So it could inform the creation of new nexus definitions. It could improve nexus. And of course, there are things that you can think on a much longer term. And in the end, ontologies, or almost like, is a bit like LLMs. You want to ask the ontology different questions. A scientist could say, okay, I'm interested in finding out which pigments a certain painter used in his painting. What technique you use for that? And with that, yeah. So with that, yeah, I will conclude. Yeah, thank you.
Is there a very, very quick question? Was it a quick?
So thanks, very interesting. And we are also grappling with similar problems when defining, let's say, optimate standard. And one of the ideas which we had for defining a method was that in each scientific experiment, we have a function which we minimize and with constraints. For example, if I solve an X-ray structure for a single crystal, I minimize the F-calc, predicted scattering amplitude difference from the observed ones. If I do this in my best possible way, possibly with constraints, then I do science. If I don't try to achieve some minimum in this sense, then it's just fantasy. Does this make some sense in your ontologies? Would it be useful? What's your take on that?
I think this goes far beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do, which is just defining techniques. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. But yes, for sure, ontologies can go much for. Essentially, we're talking about knowledge and human language, and you try to formalize that in mathematics. So yes, I think ontologies would apply to what you're saying, but the scope of what I'm talking about here is much less ambitious. And therefore also feasible, I would say.
Okay, that sounds like a beer conversation. Excellent. So thank you very much once again. I think that's working. Otherwise, I'll have to.